Namaskar, Ayubawan, good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure and it's a great privilege to speak at this second Indian Ocean Conference. And to begin, I would like to extend my congratulations and thanks to India Foundation and Shri Ram Madhavji, whose vision and untiring efforts have brought this event to such a high level. I would also like to thank all his colleagues at India Foundation and all the other partner organizations that have made this possible. I think it's worth noting something as to why such a dialogue is important. The Gaul dialogue in 2015 discussed that the existing structures of trade and commerce are overburdened. Not enough bandwidth is being devoted. And I think that is precisely why such an event plays a very important role. I'm particularly pleased to have this opportunity. We have had many discussions about ancient historical and trade links between countries in the Indian Ocean region. I'm from a part of India that played a central role in India's engagement historically throughout the Indian Ocean region. My state, the state of Odisha, was called the Kingdom of Kalinga in ancient times and has had links throughout the Indian Ocean region, but especially with Sri Lanka and with several other countries, which is why it is particularly exciting for me to be here. Since we are talking about prosperity, I think it is important to recognize that the second half of the 20th century and the decade and a half since then have seen spectacular growth of human prosperity unmatched in previous history. And it is important to understand how that came about. It came about in a post-World War II construct which created a new era of globalization. We have had earlier eras of globalization, including the ones where the civilizations of the Indian Ocean region prospered in earlier times. But in modern times, this post-World War II construct came about, and one of the key aspects to remember about this construct is that the leading powers that brought this about were not looking at a zero-sum game. There might have been a zero-sum game between the West and the other countries in the Cold War prism. But as far as integrating trade and commerce and building prosperity throughout the world, in what was known as the free world, the engagement between the most powerful nations and the least powerful nations was not a zero-sum game. It was based on creating rules. It was based on creating a new world order, which is what has enabled dozens of countries to come out of dire poverty, and indeed some of them have gone on to first world status. If you go beyond the West, in Asia, you saw in the Far East countries like Japan take first advantage of that. And here in the heart of the Indian Ocean region, you saw the ASEAN nations do what later other countries like China have done, have emulated, and now belatedly India is beginning to emulate, which is to have freer markets, freer trade, more connectivity, and the policies in place that encourage economic growth and integration, and thus the reduction of poverty and the growth of prosperity, which is what this session is all about. But we have had, and we have now, tremendous variance still in terms of prosperity levels in the Indian Ocean region. If you look at the countries that we have assembled here, per capita GDP ranges from $2,000 per year to $50,000 per year. So that's a vast range, and you can see that as a work half done. You can see that as immense potential for bringing up those countries which have not yet reached the mid-level of that range. One of the key issues, of course, and this has been mentioned in passing, is that intra-region trade is poor by normal global standards. Intra-region trade between the Indian Ocean region countries that we are talking about here has gone from $400 billion in 2005 to about $1 trillion in 2014, still small by global standards, and especially if you consider that this represents only 30% of the global trade that these countries have, the exports and imports that they have with other parts of the world. So that proves the point that the global construct, the globalization construct of post-World War II has benefited even countries in the Indian Ocean region and throughout Asia, but within the Indian Ocean region, it has not benefited as much as it should have, because we have work left to do in terms of bringing about this integration and bringing about this openness. Many such efforts are on the way. Within the Indian Ocean region, there are SASEC, there is IPEC, there is MIEC, we have talked about BIMSTEC, and many others. I would like to, as I come to the close of my presentation, these are 5 issues that I would like to highlight, which I think we have to keep in mind. These are opportunities as well as challenges if we want this vision to come into fruition and take advantage of its full potential. The 5 issues are connectivity, identity, disputes, terrorism, and climate. And of course, it goes without saying that trade is interlinked through all of these issues. The poor connectivity that we have seen is exemplified by what happened, for example, in South Asia between India and its neighboring countries. But you have seen tremendous turnaround in that. There has been mention earlier in this conference about the immense breakthroughs that have happened, for instance, between Bangladesh and India in setting aside historical problems, bringing about a new surge of investment and reconnectivity of rail and road lines and electricity and much other. So connectivity is going to be crucial throughout the Indian Ocean region in terms of infrastructure, in terms of open sea lanes, in terms of rules that apply equally to everybody. I mentioned identity because you may not think that is important, but if you think of it from a commercial point of view, think of it as branding. If we don't have a brand that ties us together, it's going to get harder to achieve this target. Earlier there was reference to how the EU, they are very disparate countries, but they have a certain Europeanness that brought together the EU. You have many other such examples, including our own ancient example in the Indian Ocean region, and thus identity, I believe, or branding if you will, is a very crucial part to make this something that is attractive to us in this region as well as to the rest of the world. Disputes are a challenge. They can also be an opportunity. I mentioned earlier about how in this modern era of globalization, the construct that was created by the leading powers like the US and European countries did not seek to create dispute, did not relish the disputes that it had with trading partners. It found ways to solve them. But in and around Asia, we have not seen that happen, even though there has been this tremendous growth of prosperity in Asian countries, including in Indian Ocean region countries. We see disputes all around the rim, all around the edges of the Indian Ocean rim countries, both on land as well as on sea, and that needs to be addressed, and not with a zero-sum outlook, but with a win-win outlook. Fourth is terrorism. This is something that has the potential to disrupt this concept of bringing together Indian Ocean region countries. And terrorism can be of many different kinds. We have experienced state-sponsored terrorism. We have experienced state-supported terrorism. We have experienced terrorism where well-known terrorists get what I would call covering fire in multilateral institutions, in the UN and in other such institutions, so that they don't get designated as terrorists, they don't get prevented from traveling or conducting financial transactions globally. That cannot coexist with the kind of integration that we are talking about. Terrorism has to be seen as terrorism that is bad for everybody in the region. It can't be that one country's terrorist is good for somebody else and bad for somebody else. Finally, I would like to touch about climate, because if climate change is not addressed, the hopes and dreams that we are all talking about are all at risk. And indeed, in the Indian Ocean region are 6 out of the 10 most vulnerable nations which are going to be impacted by climate change. One stark statistic that struck me while I was preparing for this event is that in the last 15 years, the Indian Ocean is absorbing 70% of the heat in the world. And that is bound to have negative consequences unless we deal with it very, very urgently. In India, for instance, we have had a challenge because we still had several 100 million people that don't have electricity, and the costs of renewables were not dropping fast enough until just a year or two ago. And so we had a challenge as policymakers, people like me in Parliament, that we had to keep developing and exploiting natural sources which do add to the climate change problem. But in the past 2 or 3 years, we have made a stunning turnaround with one of the most ambitious programs in the world for implementing solar and other renewable energy projects. I would like to close my presentation with a comment from the World Bank, and I quote. The World Bank says, "With a sweeping commitment to solar, India is emerging as a front runner in the global fight against climate change." This, I think, is crucial because it can't be just the Maldives and the Seychelles of the world who have a much more immediate and much more existential threat from climate change that are worried about it. It must be all of us that take action jointly. So if we can keep this in mind and work towards achieving this Indian Ocean grouping that existed in history and is coming about again, which is connectivity, identity, disputes, terrorism, and climate, I think we have a winner on hand that can be implemented much faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Panda.